You think you know where Persians come from. You've heard the story: proud ancient civilization, great empire, Aryan heritage, the birthplace of poetry and kings. It's a clean narrative, tidy. The kind of origin story that fits on a poster. But here's the problem with clean narratives. They're almost always wrong. And the story of Iranian DNA is one of the messiest, most layered, most genuinely astonishing origin puzzles on the entire planet. Because what modern genetics has found when researchers actually look at the people living inside Iran today doesn't match the myth. It doesn't match the schoolbook. It doesn't even match what most Iranians have been told about themselves. So let's go back further than anyone told you. Further back than Cyrus. Further back than the first Persian king. Further back than the word Iran even existed. Because the real story starts somewhere most people never think to look. And by the end of this, the word Persian is going to mean something completely different to you. Let's start with the land itself, because if you want to understand a people, you have to understand the ground they walked on first. Most people picture Iran as a vast, empty desert. Sand dunes, heat shimmer, a flat, hostile nothing. And parts of Iran absolutely are that. But zoom out on a topographic map, and what you're actually looking at is one of the most geographically dramatic and strategically insane pieces of real estate in human history. To the northwest, the Zagros Mountains rise like a fortress wall, ancient, folded, riddled with valleys, rivers, and microclimates. To the northeast, the Alborz Range frames the Caspian coast, a strip of humid jungle so different from the Central Plateau that it might as well be another country. In the center, the Great Salt Deserts, the Dasht-e and the Dasht-e-Lut, create natural barriers that force any movement of people along specific corridors, like water finding the only cracks in a rock. And threading through all of it, ancient trade routes connect Mesopotamia to the west, Central Asia to the northeast, the Indian subcontinent to the east, and the Persian Gulf to the south. This is not a desert wasteland. This is a pressure cooker, a place where civilizations collide by pure geographic necessity. Now here's the first question I want you to hold in your mind, because we're going to come back to it. Why did so many different waves of migration across human history either stop in Iran, settle in Iran, or get absorbed by Iran? The answer is almost entirely geographic. When you control the mountain passes, the river valleys, and the trade routes between three continents, you don't just influence history, you become the hinge it swings on. Keep that in mind, because it matters later. Now let's talk about deep roots. And this is where the first major assumption collapses. Ask most people where Persians come from, and they'll tell you, the Aryans. Indo-European migrants who swept down from the Eurasian steppe and founded the great Persian civilization. That's the schoolbook version. That's the version that got taught, repeated, and in some corners of the world, weaponized. But here's what nobody tells you. By the time any so-called Aryan migration reached what is now Iran, people had already been living there for an extraordinary length of time. We're not talking centuries, we're talking millennium. The Zagros Mountains in particular were home to some of the earliest farming communities in human history, Neolithic agricultural populations who were cultivating crops and domesticating animals, while most of the world was still hunting. And these people weren't just passing through. Genetic analyses have found patterns consistent with deep continuity in the region, a distinct ancestral population, sometimes called the Zagros Neolithic farmers in the literature, whose genetic signal doesn't disappear when the later migrations arrive. It persists, it layers, it becomes part of the foundation that everything else gets built on top of. So before we even get to empires and invasions and the great drama of history, understand this. When we talk about Iranian DNA today, we are partly talking about people whose ancestors never really left. They adapted, they mixed, they changed. But something of those ancient mountain farmers survived in the biology of the people who came after them. That is what deep roots actually looks like in genetics. Not a pure line from one heroic ancestor, but a persistent signal from people who were simply already there. Now watch what happens when you introduce the Aryan question properly, because this is where it gets uncomfortable, not in a political way, but in a the evidence doesn't match the story way. Around the mid-2nd millennium BCE, populations from the Eurasian steppe, the vast grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas, began expanding in multiple directions. Some went west into Europe. Some went east toward South Asia. Some moved south into what is now Iran. These migrations are real. Genetics confirms them. Archaeology confirms them. Linguistics confirms them, because the Indo-European language family, which includes Persian, is one of the clearest fingerprints of this expansion. But here's the thing that changes everything. The steppe ancestry signal in modern Iranians, while present, is not dominant. It's a layer. A significant one, yes, but it sits on top of the older Zagros farmer foundation rather than replacing it. The Aryan migration didn't arrive in an empty land and build a civilization from scratch. It arrived in a place that was already ancient, already complex, already populated by people with their own culture, their own ancestry, their own long history in those mountains and valleys. What happened next wasn't replacement. It was fusion. And that fusion, that layering of new migration on top of old roots, is the genetic signature you still find in Iranians today. This is where the Aryan story isn't what you were sold. Before we go any deeper into this, and trust me, it gets even more layered from here. If origins like this are the kind of thing that genuinely blows your mind, hit subscribe. We do this every single week. New episode, new origin story, new myth taken apart, piece by piece. Alright, now let's get to the part that reframes everything. Because up to this point, we've been talking about what happened before the Persian Empire, the deep roots, the Zagros farmers, the steppe migration. But the moment you introduce the empire itself, the story takes a turn that most people completely miss. The conventional assumption is that the Persian Empire was a Persian invention. One people, one culture, one ethnic identity, expanding outward and stamping its identity on everyone it conquered. That's how empires usually work, right? Rome made everyone Roman. The Mongols made everyone subordinate to Mongol power. But Cyrus the Great and the Achaemenid rulers who followed him did something genuinely unusual in the ancient world. They built what was, by the standards of their time, a deliberately multi-ethnic administrative machine. Achaemenid court records, and this is one of the places where the historical evidence is actually quite clear, show a remarkable degree of ethnic and cultural diversity in the running of the empire. Different peoples administering their own regions in their own languages. Different religious practices tolerated. Conquered populations often maintained rather than displaced. Now, this is where the duality comes in, and you have to hold both truths at once. The Persian Empire was simultaneously one of the ancient world's most tolerant political structures and one of its most aggressive military forces. It conquered an enormous territory. It extracted enormous wealth. People died. People were enslaved. Populations were moved by imperial decree. The myth of Persian benevolence is real, and it is also incomplete. Tolerance in the Achaemenid model was partly genuine cultural philosophy, and partly a very sophisticated control strategy. If you let people keep their gods and their customs and their local administrators, they're less likely to rebel. Less rebellion means lower military costs. Lower military costs mean more resources for expansion. The tolerance and the conquest weren't opposites. They were the same machine, running on different settings. And here's why this matters for the DNA. An empire that absorbs rather than erases leaves a genetic fingerprint. The populations that came into contact with Persian power, including Mesopotamians, Lydians, Egyptians, Scythians, Greeks, Bactrians, and Indians, didn't vanish. They interacted, they traded, they intermarried at every level of society, from merchants to soldiers to court officials. That interaction moved genes. This is why the DNA looks like it does. The Persian Empire didn't just spread Persian culture outward, it pulled the genetics of half the ancient world inward. Now here's a segment that almost never gets mentioned, and I think it's one of the most fascinating parts of this whole story. Most people think of Persian influence as a regional thing. The Middle East, maybe Central Asia, the fringes of the ancient world. But here's what nobody tells you. Genetic and cultural fingerprints consistent with Iranian origin populations show up in places that seem almost impossible. The Balkans, parts of South Asia, coastal East Africa. This isn't magic. It's the logical consequence of being the hub of the ancient world's trade network for centuries. When you sit at the intersection of the Silk Road, the spice routes, the horse trade corridors, and the maritime connections of the Indian Ocean, your people move. Your merchants settle. Your soldiers garrison distant posts and sometimes never come home. And language is one of the clearest tracers of this reach. Persian loanwords are embedded in dozens of languages that have no obvious direct connection to Iran. Urdu and Hindi carry enormous Persian influence. Swahili has Persian origin vocabulary. Ottoman Turkish was saturated with Persian to the point where educated Ottomans wrote poetry in Persian. Even some European languages picked up Persian words through Arabic intermediaries. Words so common now that nobody thinks twice about their origin. Think of that as a kind of linguistic genetics. Every loanword is a fossil of contact. Every Persian echo in a foreign language is a record of a moment when these two worlds touched, the empire that hid inside every language. And if words traveled that far, people did too. Research suggests patterns of genetic overlap between Iranian origin populations and communities along these ancient trade and conquest corridors that are consistent with centuries of movement, settlement, and intermixing. Not invasion, not replacement. The quieter, slower genetics of trade and migration, and people simply ending up somewhere new and staying. Now let's talk about the actual DNA evidence, because this is where the detective work gets genuinely interesting, and where the myth really falls apart. Think of modern Iranian genetics not as a single signal, but as a layered recording. The oldest layer is the Zagros Neolithic signal, genetic patterns consistent with those ancient farming populations who were in the region long before any of the famous historical migrations. This signal represents deep continuity. Someone stayed, generation after generation, through ice ages and climate shifts and the rise and fall of civilizations. Some portion of the population just kept living in those mountain valleys and passing their DNA forward. That's not nothing. That's actually remarkable. The second layer is the steppe ancestry, the signal associated with the Indo-European expansion. It's there. Genetic analyses have found patterns consistent with this contribution in modern Iranians. But as we established, it's a contribution, not a takeover. The third layer is what researchers sometimes describe as Semitic adjacent clustering. Genetic patterns reflecting the long, deep, continuous contact between the populations of ancient Iran and the populations of ancient Mesopotamia, the Levant, and the Arabian Peninsula. These weren't separate worlds with a clean border between them. They were neighbors for thousands of years. They traded, they fought, they intermarried. They converted to each other's religions, and then back again. That kind of sustained contact over millennia leaves a mark in the biology. And here's the detail that really lands the point home. Modern Iranians cluster distinctly from both Arab populations and South Asian populations in genetic studies. They're not the same. The DNA doesn't match the simplification. Iranians are not Arabs with a different language. They're not South Asians with a different history. They occupy their own genetic space, a space that was shaped by all of the above, but is not reducible to any single one of them. That's the signature of a crossroads people. Not pure, not simple, something far more interesting. And this is where the male versus female ancestry patterns become a kind of detective tool all on their own. In conquest events, male genetic lineages often shift dramatically, while female lineages show more continuity. Why? Because conquest historically moved men, soldiers, rulers, colonists. Trade moved everyone. In populations that experienced both conquest and sustained trade contact over long periods, you sometimes see a gap between the two patterns, and research suggests Iranian populations show complexity in exactly this kind of layered signal, consistent with a history that was neither purely conquest nor purely peaceful exchange, but an ongoing mixture of both. Every valley in Iran tells a slightly different version of this story. The populations of the Caspian coast carry different proportions of these layers than the populations of Fars province. The Kurds in the northwest carry different signals than the Baloch in the southeast. Iran is not one genetic population pretending to be one nation. It's a mosaic of populations that all share a common geographic frame and a common historical experience, while each carrying their own specific combination of the ancient layers. Different valleys, different histories, same country. That's not a weakness in the identity. That's actually the definition of it. Now let's come back to where we started. One proud, ancient, pure people with a single heroic origin. That's the poster version. That's the myth. And after everything we've just walked through, I hope it feels as small as it actually is, because the reality is so much bigger. Try this instead. What we call Persian or Iranian today is the product of at least 4 distinct founding layers that we can trace genetically and historically. Ancient Zagros mountain farmers who were building some of the world's first agricultural societies while most of humanity was still nomadic. Steppe migrants who brought Indo-European language and new genetic lineages south into a land that was already complex and ancient. Mesopotamian and Semitic neighbors whose centuries of contact left both cultural and genetic marks that are still visible in modern Iranian DNA. And the absorptive effect of an empire that pulled the genetics of half the ancient world into its administrative, military, and commercial machinery. One crossroads continent, 10,000 years of mixing, 4 founding layers at minimum. The origin story isn't clean, it never was. And here's the universal truth, hiding inside all of this. The oldest identities are never the simplest ones. Every culture that has survived long enough to feel ancient has survived precisely because it was flexible enough to absorb, adapt, layer, and transform. The purity myth is always the new version of the story. The messy, complicated, genetically layered truth is always the older one. Persian doesn't describe a single ethnic line stretching back to one founding ancestor. It describes something far more remarkable, a people shaped by geography, by migration, by empire, by trade, by thousands of years of being the place where the ancient world's roads crossed. The DNA doesn't match the myth, and that's not a scandal. That's a far better story. So here's my question for you, and I genuinely want to know in the comments. Which layer of this surprised you the most? Was it the ancient farmers who were already there long before any migration arrived? Was it the way the empire absorbed genetics rather than just erasing them? Or was it seeing how far the Persian fingerprint actually reached, into languages and populations most people never connect to Iran at all? Drop it in the comments. I read them. And if you want to know where we're going next, we're heading to the people who lived right next door to Persia for thousands of years, who influenced Persian culture at every level, who appear in the records, in the genetics, and in the archaeology, and who have been almost completely written out of the popular version of Middle Eastern history. Their origin story is just as layered, just as complicated, and if anything, even less understood. That one's coming next. Don't miss it.